March 6, 1944. 22,000 feet above Brunswick, Germany. The sky is a frozen blue vault. Oberleutnant Klaus Müller pulls his Focke-Wulf 190 into a climbing turn, oxygen mask tight against his face, eyes scanning the horizon through the gun sight glass. Below him, the American bomber stream moves like a dark river through the clouds. B-17s, dozens of them, stacked in combat boxes, their contrails stitching white lines across the Reich. He's done this 100 times. Wait for the escorts to turn back. Hit the bombers in the gap. Break away before the next fighter wave arrives. But today, something is wrong. The silver fighters, Mustangs sleek and fast, are still there. They're not turning back. They're 400 kilometers inside Germany, and they're not turning back. Muller's wingman calls over the radio, voice tight, "Sie bleiben." They're staying. For 2 years, the Luftwaffe had one advantage the Americans couldn't break: distance. Deep inside the Reich, German fighters own the sky. Not anymore. The last safe corridor just collapsed. The air war over Europe was never supposed to reach this point. In 1942, American strategic bombing doctrine rested on a single, unshakable belief: the heavy bomber could defend itself. The B-17 Flying Fortress, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, flying in tight defensive formations, would penetrate enemy airspace, deliver its payload, and fight its way home. Escort fighters were considered helpful, but not essential. The bomber, they believed, would always get through. The Luftwaffe proved them wrong. Throughout 1942 and into early 1943, German day fighters developed tactics specifically designed to shatter American bomber formations. They attacked head-on, exploiting the B-17's weakest defensive arc. They used heavy cannon, 20 millimeters, 30 millimeters, fired from outside the range of the bomber's machine guns. They coordinated mass attacks, overwhelming gunners with simultaneous threats from multiple angles. The Americans bled, but the real killer wasn't tactics. It was geography. American escort fighters in 1943, primarily P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, had operational ranges between 300 and 400 miles. That meant they could escort bombers partway into France, maybe as far as the German border, before fuel reserves forced them to turn back. Beyond that line, the bombers flew alone. And beyond that line, the Luftwaffe waited. German fighter controllers learned to track the escort withdrawal. They held their interceptors back, letting the American fighters burn fuel on the inbound leg, then scrambled once the escorts peeled off. For the bombers, that moment, watching the last P-47 waggle its wings and turn west, was when the killing started. The Schweinfurt Regensburg raids in August 1943 illustrated the cost. On August 17th, 376 B-17s launched toward ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt and Messerschmitt plants in Regensburg. The targets were deep inside Germany, beyond effective escort range. The plan relied on speed, surprise, and the hope that splitting the force would divide German defenses. It didn't work. Luftwaffe fighters swarmed the unescorted formations. They came in waves: Bf-109s, Fw-190s, even twin-engine Bf-110 destroyers mounting heavy rockets. 60 bombers went down. Over 600 men killed or captured. Hundreds more wounded. The ball-bearing factories were hit, but production recovered within weeks. The raid proved what many had feared. Without escorts, deep penetration was suicide. The Americans tried again in October. Second Schweinfurt. This time, 291 bombers. Same target, same problem. 60 more bombers lost. The 8th Air Force couldn't sustain losses like that. At that attrition rate, bomber crews had less than a 25% chance of surviving a full tour of duty, 25 missions over occupied Europe. Some bomb groups lost half their aircraft in a single month. Morale fractured. Replacement crews arrived, flew 3 missions, and died before anyone learned their names. German pilots, meanwhile, grew bolder. They knew the patterns. They knew where the escorts turned back. They knew the Americans would keep coming. Doctrine demanded it, and Washington wouldn't abandon strategic bombing. So the Luftwaffe built entire defensive systems around the escort gap. Fighter bases clustered just inside the unescorted zones. Early warning networks tracked bomber formations from the French coast. Tactics evolved. Mass attacks, heavy armament, even air-to-air bombing runs against formations. For a time, it worked. The Reich's airspace, deep beyond escort range, became a killing ground. But the Americans were already building the solution. In late 1943, two developments began to shift the balance. The first was operational, external drop tanks. Disposable fuel tanks mounted under fighter wings extended range without sacrificing performance. When the tanks emptied, pilots jettisoned them and fought clean. It wasn't elegant, but it added 200 miles to a fighter's effective radius. The second was technological, the P-51 Mustang. Originally designed for the British, the Mustang married an American airframe to a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The result was a fighter with speed, maneuverability, and, critically, range. With drop tanks, a P-51 could escort bombers 850 miles from base. That meant Berlin. That meant anywhere in the Reich. The first Mustang groups arrived in England in late 1943. By December, they were flying escort missions. By January 1944, they were reaching targets the Luftwaffe thought untouchable. And the Germans began to realize what was coming. The Luftwaffe had always relied on depth. Germany's fighter defenses were layered across hundreds of miles. Early warning radar along the coasts, fighter bases scattered through France and the Low Countries, reserve wings positioned deeper inside the Reich. The system was designed to bleed attackers across distance, forcing them to fight their way in and fight their way out, attrition compounding with every mile. It worked because the Americans had to come to them. Strategic bombing demanded persistent pressure. Factories, rail yards, oil refineries, ball bearing plants. These targets didn't move. The bombers had to penetrate, regardless of cost. And until early 1944, that cost remained brutally predictable. The deeper the mission, the higher the losses. German fighter pilots understood this calculus intimately. They knew that every mission beyond the escort line was a mission they could influence. They didn't need to destroy every bomber. They just needed to make the price unbearable. But the arrival of long-range American fighters disrupted that entire structure. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe couldn't wait out the escorts. The Mustangs and uprated P-38 stayed with the bombers all the way to target, through the bomb run, and back out again. German controllers could no longer time their interceptions for the unescorted gaps, because the gaps no longer existed. The entire depth of the Reich's airspace, once a defensive advantage, became a hunting ground for American fighters with fuel to burn and orders to engage aggressively. The strategic implications were immediate. In January 1944, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, later known as Big Week. The objective was to destroy Germany's aircraft production capacity through sustained, round-the-clock bombing. The RAF hit factories at night, the Americans struck by day. The operation required deep penetration missions to Leipzig, Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, targets 400 to 500 miles inside Germany. 2 years earlier, missions like that would have been catastrophic. But now, the bombers flew with full fighter escort. P-51s and P-47s with extended tanks accompanied them to the targets and back. For the first time, Luftwaffe interceptors faced a fight they couldn't dictate. They had to engage through screens of American fighters or let the bombers through. Either choice carried consequences. German losses spiked. Experienced pilots, the veterans who'd survived the Eastern Front, the Battle of Britain, 2 years of bomber interceptions, started dying in numbers the training pipeline couldn't replace. Fighter production remained steady, but pilot quality collapsed. New replacements arrived at frontline units with 60 hours of flight time, sometimes less. They learned to fight by fighting, and most didn't survive long enough to learn. Fuel shortages compounded the crisis. By mid-1944, Allied bombing of German synthetic oil plants began to strangle the Luftwaffe's logistical backbone. Trainers sat grounded. Operational units rationed sorties. Pilots flew less, trained less, died faster. The Americans, meanwhile, could afford to lose fighters and replace them within weeks. They could afford to lose pilots and retrain them in relative safety stateside before sending them back. The Luftwaffe couldn't afford any of it. Strategically, the collapse of the escort gap meant something even larger: air superiority over the Reich itself. Once American fighters could range freely across German airspace, they didn't just escort bombers. They strafed airfields. They hunted trains. They attacked anything that moved by day. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and experienced pilots, increasingly ceded daylight operations entirely. German commanders recognized the danger. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, issued increasingly desperate orders. He demanded his pilots ram bombers if they ran out of ammunition. He accused them of cowardice when they broke off engagements to save fuel. He promised new jet fighters, the Me-262, that would restore German air superiority. But jets remained months away from operational deployment, and even then, fuel and pilot shortages would cripple their effectiveness. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top aces and a senior Luftwaffe officer, understood the reality more clearly. In early 1944, he wrote candidly about the situation. The Americans were winning the air war through sheer material weight and technological reach. German pilots were brave, skilled, and determined, but they were fighting a losing battle of attrition against an enemy that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. And now, with long-range escorts, they were fighting that battle with no safe fallback. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. For 2 years, they'd known that deep inside the Reich, they had room to maneuver. They could break off, rearm, refuel, attack again. They could choose their engagements. They could retreat to bases beyond American reach and regroup. Not anymore. American fighters followed them home. P-51s loitered over German airfields, waiting for fighters to land with empty guns and dry tanks. Pilots who survived combat often died trying to land. The Luftwaffe's own bases, once sanctuaries, became kill zones, and there was nowhere left to run. The last safe air corridors, the deep Reich spaces where German fighters had operated with impunity, were gone. American fighters own them now, and every Luftwaffe pilot lifting off in the spring of 1944 knew it. The war in the air had shifted irreversibly. What had been a grinding battle of attrition became a systematic destruction of Germany's daylight fighter force. The Luftwaffe could still inflict losses, still mount local defenses, still produce aircraft, but it could no longer control its own skies. And once that control was lost, everything else began to unravel. Tactical, the fighter that changed everything. The P-51 Mustang wasn't supposed to be a war winner. North American Aviation designed it in 1940 for the British, who needed fighters fast and didn't care about prestige. The initial versions, powered by Allison engines, were decent low-altitude fighters but mediocre at the high altitudes where bombers operated. The RAF used them for ground attack and reconnaissance. Nobody expected greatness. Then someone bolted a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine onto the airframe. The transformation was immediate. The Merlin, the same engine powering Spitfires, gave the Mustang speed, climb rate, and crucially, high-altitude performance. At 25,000 feet, where Luftwaffe interceptors hunted bombers, the P-51B could outrun, outclimb, and outturn almost anything Germany fielded. It was faster than the FW-190 above 20,000 feet. It was more maneuverable than the Bf-109 at all altitudes. And with external drop tanks, it could fly 1,300 miles round trip. That range redefined air warfare. AP-51 taking off from England could reach Berlin, fight for 15 minutes over the target, and return home with fuel to spare. That operational radius covered the entire Reich. It meant Luftwaffe pilots could no longer count on distance as a defense. It meant nowhere was safe. The tactical applications unfolded rapidly. American fighter doctrine shifted from purely defensive escort to aggressive pursuit. Mustang pilots were authorized, encouraged even, to break formation and chase German fighters. The goal wasn't just to protect bombers. It was to destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it appeared. If German fighters engaged, P-51s hunted them. If they retreated, P-51s followed. If they landed, P-51s strafed them on the ground. The fighter sweep became standard procedure. Groups of P-51s would range ahead of bomber formations, clearing airspace, provoking the Luftwaffe into fights on American terms. Other groups stayed with the bombers as close escort. Still others trailed behind, catching German fighters as they recovered and rearmed. The entire escort operation became a layered trap, and the Luftwaffe had no good response. German pilots respected the Mustang immediately. They'd fought P-47 Thunderbolts and knew how to exploit their weaknesses. Heavy, less maneuverable, shorter range. They'd fought P-38 Lightnings and learned to dive away from their twin-engine climb rates. But the P-51 had no exploitable weakness at combat altitudes. It was faster in level flight. It turned tighter, it climbed better, and it had the fuel to press any engagement. Luftwaffe Ace Heinz Noke wrote in his diary after encountering Mustangs, "They can do everything we can do, but better, and they can do it over our own airfields." The tactical balance had flipped. Where German fighters once dictated engagement terms, when to attack, when to break off, now American fighters controlled the fight. Luftwaffe pilots found themselves reacting, defending, retreating. The psychological shift was as important as the tactical one. Air combat is about confidence, split-second decisions, and the belief that your aircraft gives you a fighting chance. Against Mustangs, deep over Germany, Luftwaffe pilots increasingly lack that belief. Psychological, the collapse of sanctuary. War pilots survive on calculated risk. They learn their aircraft's limits, their own limits, the patterns of combat. They develop instincts, when to attack, when to evade, when to disengage. Those instincts rely on predictability, knowing that if things go wrong, there's a way out, a place to retreat, room to recover. For Luftwaffe pilots through 1943, that sanctuary was geography. Deep inside Germany, they fought on home ground. They knew the terrain, the airfields, the rally points. If they took damage, they could glide toward friendly territory. If they ran low on ammunition, they could break off and land without American fighters following. The depth of the Reich wasn't just defensive strategy, it was psychological armor. The arrival of long-range American escorts shattered that armor. Suddenly, there was no safe distance. American fighters appeared over targets 500 miles inside Germany. They lingered after the bombers departed, hunting stragglers. They followed damaged German fighters back toward their bases and finished them off during vulnerable landing approaches. Luftwaffe pilots who survived combat often died in the landing pattern, wheels down, flaps extended, too slow to maneuver. The bases themselves stopped feeling safe. Pilots would taxi back after a mission, ground crews rushing to rearm and refuel, and P-51s would appear at treetop level, strafing the flight line. Aircraft burned on the tarmac. Fuel trucks exploded. Pilots scrambled into slit trenches, helpless, watching their fighters destroyed before they could take off again. The psychological toll compounded rapidly. Combat stress is manageable when soldiers believe they have some control, some agency in their survival. But when the enemy appears everywhere, when retreat offers no safety, when home bases become battlefields, that sense of control evaporates. Luftwaffe pilots began showing signs of deep fatigue, slower reaction times, hesitation in engagements, reluctance to pursue damaged bombers if it meant extended combat. Some simply stopped fighting effectively. Reports from Luftwaffe units in early 1944 describe pilots making single passes at bomber formations, firing briefly, then diving away regardless of the tactical situation. They weren't cowards. Many were veterans with dozens of kills. They were exhausted, outnumbered, and aware that every sortie might be their last. The will to press attacks, to take risks, eroded steadily. Others cracked more visibly. Instances of pilots claiming mechanical failures increased. Some landed at forward fields and refused to fly back to their units. A few defected outright, flying to neutral countries or landing at Allied airfields. Disciplinary actions rose. Göring's accusations of cowardice, rather than motivating pilots, deepened resentment and demoralization. The Luftwaffe had always prided itself on aggressive spirit, on the offensive mindset drilled into pilots from training. But morale is fragile. It relies on trust in leadership, belief in the mission, and confidence in eventual victory. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe pilots had lost all three. They didn't believe their commanders understood the situation. They didn't believe defending the Reich was possible with the resources provided. And they certainly didn't believe Germany could win the air war. What remained was duty. And for many, even that wasn't enough. Wars are fought by soldiers, but often decided by engineers. The P-51 Mustang represented a convergence of incremental technological advances, each individually modest but collectively transformative. It wasn't a wonder weapon. It was simply a very good aircraft built by a nation with the industrial capacity to produce it in overwhelming numbers. The Merlin engine was the core advantage. Rolls-Royce's V-12 liquid-cooled engine had been refined over years of combat experience. It delivered 1,490 horsepower at war emergency settings, with a two-stage supercharger that maintained performance above 25,000 feet. That supercharger was critical. It allowed the Mustang to fight effectively at altitudes where Luftwaffe interceptors operated, without losing speed or climb rate. German engines, by comparison, struggled at high altitude. The BMW 801 radial in the FW190 was powerful at low to medium altitudes, but lost effectiveness above 20,000 feet. The Daimler-Benz DB605 and the BF109 performed better at altitude, but still couldn't match the Merlin's sustained power. German engineers knew this and worked desperately on improvements, but development cycles stretched as resources dwindled. The Mustang's aerodynamics provided another edge. North Americans' designers used laminar flow wings, a profile that reduced drag by encouraging smooth airflow over the surface. In practice, laminar flow was difficult to maintain. Dirt, rivets, and combat damage disrupted it, but even partial gains translated to higher speeds and better fuel efficiency. The Mustang cruised faster than most fighters fought. Drop tanks extended that efficiency into devastating range. American factories produced standardized external fuel tanks, 75-gallon, 108-gallon, even 150-gallon versions. Pilots took off with tanks mounted under the wings, burned them during the cruise to target, then jettisoned them before combat. The system was simple, reliable, and scalable. By early 1944, every P-51 mission included drop tanks as standard equipment. The Luftwaffe tried to copy the concept, but struggled with production. German drop tanks were often handmade, inconsistent, and prone to mechanical issues. Fuel quality problems meant tanks sometimes didn't feed properly. Shortages of raw materials limited manufacturing. The Luftwaffe never achieved the widespread, reliable drop tank usage that gave American fighters their range advantage. Even German attempts to counter the Mustang technologically fell short. The Focke-Wulf Tau 152 and BF-109K variants introduced late-war improvements, but they arrived in tiny numbers and too late to matter. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter promised revolutionary performance, but fuel shortages, maintenance difficulties, and inadequate pilot training neutered its potential. Germany had the engineering talent. It lacked the resources, time, and industrial stability to deploy solutions at scale. The Americans, meanwhile, simply built more Mustangs. By mid-1944, P-51 production exceeded 500 aircraft per month. Factories in California and Texas ran around the clock. Replacement aircraft arrived in England within weeks of losses. If a Mustang went down, another took its place. The Luftwaffe couldn't match that industrial rhythm. Technology, in the end, wasn't just about superior design. It was about superior production, logistics, and sustainment. The P-51 worked because America could build it in quantity, maintain it in the field, and replace it rapidly. Germany's best designs remained concepts or arrived in numbers too small to influence outcomes. The engineering edge wasn't a single breakthrough. It was systemic superiority across every aspect of air warfare logistics. And the Luftwaffe had no answer for it. The Luftwaffe's institutional collapse began long before American fighters reached Berlin. Hermann Göring, Reich's marshal and commander of the Luftwaffe, had spent the war insulated from operational reality. A World War I ace and early Nazi loyalist, Göring had prestige in Hitler's favor, but by 1944, he was a liability. Overweight, addicted to morphine, obsessed with art collections looted from occupied territories, he issued orders disconnected from the war his pilots were losing. His response to the long-range fighter crisis was denial. When frontline commanders reported American escorts reaching deep into Germany, Göring accused them of cowardice and exaggeration. When loss rates spiked, he blamed pilot morale rather than strategic realities. He refused to acknowledge that the Luftwaffe faced a materially superior enemy fighting with better logistics, better technology, and better operational planning. Instead, Göring issued impossible directives. He demanded pilots ram bombers if they exhausted ammunition, an act of desperation disguised as heroism. He threatened courts-martial for pilots who broke off engagements prematurely. He promised new aircraft, new tactics, new offensives that never materialized. His leadership became a liability that operational commanders had to work around rather than through. Adolf Galland, general of the fighter arm, understood the situation clearly. A veteran ace with over 100 kills, Galland had credibility Göring lacked. He advocated for concentrating fighter forces, prioritizing pilot training, and developing the Me-262 jet as quickly as possible. He argued that Germany needed defensive depth and strategic patience, absorb American pressure, trade space for time, rebuild strength. Göring ignored him. Worse, Hitler interfered directly. The Führer insisted the Me-262 be reconfigured as a bomber rather than a fighter, wasting months of development time on a role the aircraft wasn't optimized for. When Galland protested, Hitler dismissed his concerns. Operational experience meant nothing against ideological conviction. The leadership paralysis extended downward. Fighter wing commanders received contradictory orders: conserve pilots, but intercept every bomber raid; preserve aircraft, but engage aggressively; train replacements, but launch them into combat with minimal preparation. The institutional confusion eroded unit cohesion and left experienced leaders with impossible choices. Some adapted despite the chaos. Commanders like Johannes Steinhoff and Hannes Trotloff found ways to preserve their units, rotating pilots through rest periods, scrounging fuel and ammunition, focusing on survivable tactics rather than suicidal glory. But these were individual efforts, localized successes in a structure failing systemically. Meanwhile, American leadership operated with clarity. General Carl Spaatz, commanding U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, understood that air superiority required destroying the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. He authorized aggressive fighter tactics, supported long-range escort development, and coordinated with Bomber Command to maximize pressure on German defenses. His leadership was pragmatic, flexible, and focused on measurable outcomes. Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, went further. In January 1944, Doolittle issued new orders to fighter groups: stop flying close escort. Instead, pursue and destroy German fighters wherever found. The goal wasn't just protecting bombers. It was annihilating the Luftwaffe. The shift turned American fighters from reactive defenders into proactive hunters. The contrast in leadership philosophies was stark. American commanders empowered subordinates, adapted tactics based on battlefield results, and aligned resources with strategic objectives. German leadership, fractured by ideology and personality conflicts, issued directives divorced from reality and punished honesty with accusations of defeatism. The Luftwaffe's pilots paid the price for that leadership failure. Luftwaffe fighter pilots weren't anonymous conscripts. They were names, faces, men with histories. By 1944, the best of them had survived years of combat. Eastern Front veterans who'd flown through Barbarossa's initial onslaught. Battle of Britain survivors who'd fought Spitfires over southern England. North Africa veterans who'd dueled P-40s in desert skies. They were skilled, experienced, and irreplaceable. And they were dying. The arrival of long-range American escorts turned attrition into bloodletting. Veterans who'd survived hundreds of missions found themselves outnumbered, outperformed, and out of options. The tactics that kept them alive, situational awareness, energy management, knowing when to disengage, stopped working when American fighters followed them home. Hauptmann Hans Philipp, an ace with 206 victories, died in October 1943 engaging P-47 Thunderbolts. He'd survived 3 years of Eastern Front combat, countless dogfights, crashes, wounds. American escorts killed him over Nordhorn. Major Egon Mayer, credited with developing head-on attacks against bomber formations, died in March 1944. He had 102 victories. P-47s shot him down near Montmedy, France. Oberleutnant Joachim Kirschner, 188 victories, died in December 1943. Major Walter Osaw, 127 victories, died in May 1944. The list grew weekly. These weren't random losses. They were the institutional backbone of the Luftwaffe fighter force, the men who trained new pilots, who led formations, who held units together under pressure. Their deaths accelerated the force's collapse because their experience couldn't be replaced. German pilot training, already strained, buckled under the losses. In 1941, Luftwaffe fighter trainees received 240 hours of flight instruction before assignment to operational units. By 1944, that number dropped below 100 hours. Some pilots arrived at frontline squadrons with 60 hours total flight time and no gunnery training. They learned to fight by fighting, and most died before accumulating meaningful experience. The veterans who remained bore impossible burdens. Squadron leaders flew multiple sorties daily, mentoring green replacements while engaging numerically superior American formations. They couldn't refuse missions. The Reich needed every sortie. They couldn't rest. Replacements weren't ready to lead. They flew until they died, because there was no one else. The psychological weight was crushing. Gunther Rahl, a high-scoring ace who survived the war, later described the period. We were no longer fighting to win. We were fighting to delay the inevitable. Every morning, we looked at the new faces, boys, really, and knew most wouldn't see the next week. And we had to send them up anyway. Some veterans requested transfers to bombers, night fighters, anywhere that offered relief from the daylight fighter war. Others simply burned out, flew mechanically, survived through luck, stopped taking initiative. A few, like Gallen himself, pushed for jets as a psychological escape, a hope that new technology might restore balance. It didn't. The human cost extended beyond deaths. Wounded pilots often returned to duty too quickly, still injured, because replacement pools ran dry. Pilots flew with untreated frostbite, half-healed burns, psychological trauma. Medical standards dropped. If a man could climb into a cockpit, he flew. The contrast with American pilot experiences was brutal. U.S. fighter pilots completed tours of duty, typically 50 missions in Europe, then rotated home. They received leave, rest, training billets stateside. If they returned for second tours, they did so with months of recovery behind them. The system was sustainable. Germany's system was attrition by design. Luftwaffe pilots flew until they died, were captured, or became too wounded to continue. There were no rotations home, no tour limits, no institutional recognition that human beings have breaking points. The force consumed its own personnel as ruthlessly as it consumed fuel and ammunition. And by mid-1944, there was almost nothing left to consume. For American fighter pilots, the war changed in early 1944. Before long-range escorts, fighter missions were frustrating. Pilots flew tight formations around bombers, watching Luftwaffe fighters attack from beyond engagement range, unable to pursue because doctrine demanded they stay with the bombers. It was defensive, reactive, and unsatisfying. Fighters were built to hunt, and American pilots wanted to hunt. Doolittle's directive in January 1944 changed everything. Break formation, engage, pursue. Suddenly, fighter pilots had permission to do what they'd been trained for. The P-51 groups especially embraced the new aggressiveness. They ranged ahead of bomber streams, looking for trouble. They broke off to chase individual German fighters. They followed retreating Luftwaffe aircraft all the way to their airfields and strafed them on the ground. It was, for many American pilots, exhilarating. Captain Don Gentile, an ace with the 4th Fighter Group, described it bluntly. We weren't babysitting bombers anymore. We were wolf-packing. We were hunting them down, and they couldn't get away. The long-range capability turned every mission into a deep raid. American pilots flew 800-mile round trips, fought over targets, and still had fuel to loiter on the way home, looking for targets of opportunity. They strafed trains. They shot up truck convoys. They destroyed parked aircraft. The Luftwaffe couldn't predict where American fighters would appear because they could appear anywhere. The psychological advantage was immense. German pilots flew defensively, knowing they were outnumbered and technologically matched. American pilots flew with confidence. Better aircraft, better fuel supply, better odds of survival. That confidence translated into aggressiveness in combat. American pilots pressed attacks longer, took calculated risks, and dominated engagements through sheer determination. Not every fight went their way. The Luftwaffe still had skilled pilots, and experienced German aces could exploit American mistakes. But even successful German pilots faced a grinding reality. They might win individual dogfights, but they were losing the larger war of attrition. Every sortie depleted fuel reserves, ammunition, and nerves. American pilots, meanwhile, were building a community of experienced aces. Men like George Preddy, John Meyer, and Francis Gabreski accumulated kills rapidly, shared tactics, mentored newer pilots. The 4th, 56th, and 357 fighter groups became legendary, their kill totals climbing, their confidence infectious. They weren't just fighting, they were winning visibly and repeatedly. The strafing missions became particularly feared. Luftwaffe airfields, once safe rear areas, turned into death traps. American fighters would arrive at low altitude, 300 miles inside Germany, and tear through parked aircraft before anyone could react. Pilots on the ground, waiting to take off, could only watch as their FW-190s and BF-109s exploded in flames. Major George Preddy, one of the top American aces, destroyed multiple German aircraft on the ground in a single strafing pass during one mission. His kill count included both aerial victories and ground destructions. The Luftwaffe was being gutted on the tarmac as well as in the air. For the Americans, it wasn't personal. It was a job. Most fighter pilots respected their German counterparts as skilled opponents. But the war demanded relentless pressure, and the long-range fighters provided the tool to apply it. The mission was simple: destroy the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground until it could no longer contest Allied air superiority. By spring 1944, that mission was succeeding. February 20th, 1944, 0900 hours, RAF Debden, England. The briefing room is packed. Pilots from the 4th Fighter Group, the Eagles, lean forward in their chairs, watching the map. Red ribbons stretch from England across the North Sea, through Holland, deep into Germany. The target, Leipzig. Aircraft factories, assembly plants. 900 bombers inbound. The deepest penetration yet. And for the first time, fighters will escort them all the way. Colonel Don Blakesley, the group commander, stands at the front. His voice is flat, matter of fact. We're taking them in, and we're bringing them out. Drop tanks get you there. You'll fight clean. Stay aggressive. If you see Germans, kill them. If they run, follow them. If they land, strafe them. Someone asks about fuel margins. Blakesley doesn't blink. If you can't make it back, land in Russia. But don't leave the bombers. This is Big Week. 6 days of maximum effort bombing, designed to break Germany's aircraft production and bleed the Luftwaffe dry. The whole strategy hinges on one thing: long-range fighters maintaining escort through the entire mission profile. If the escorts fail, the bombers die. If the bombers die, the offensive collapses. It's all or nothing. 1,045 hours. 24,000 feet above Osnabrück, Germany. The bomber stream is a river of aluminum, B-17s and B-24s stacked in combat boxes stretching for miles. Their contrails paint the sky white. Around them, silver P-51s and P-38s weave in loose formations, scanning for threats. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying AP-47 Thunderbolt, adjusts his oxygen mask and checks his fuel. The drop tanks are still feeding. Good. They're 300 miles inside Germany, and they're not turning back. Below, German radar operators track the formation. Luftwaffe fighter controllers scramble every available unit. JG-3, JG-11, JG-26. Jagdgeschwader fighter wings from across northern Germany launch toward the intercept. Over 200 German fighters are airborne, climbing hard, vectoring toward the Americans. But this time, they're not waiting for an escort gap. Because there is no gap. 1,110 hours. Near Brunswick, Major Gunther Specht leads a staffel of Bf-109s into position. His wingmen are tight, experienced. They've done this 100 times. Hit the bombers fast, break through the escorts, unload cannon fire into the formations, then dive away before the fighters react. Except the fighters are already reacting. Mustangs break toward them, silver blurs slashing across the sky. Specht calls the break, rolls hard left, but the P-51s are faster. They don't follow predictably. They anticipate, cut angles, stay inside his turn radius. His wingman calls a warning, voice sharp, then goes silent. Specht pulls tighter, feels the G-forces crushing his chest, vision narrowing. He's fighting for position, for angle, for survival. The Mustang behind him doesn't relent. Tracers flash past his canopy. He kicks rudder, snaps inverted, pulls through into a split S. The Mustang follows. At 8,000 feet, Specht levels out, firewalls the throttle, heading east. The Mustang is still there, still closing. He's 400 kilometers inside Germany, and there's nowhere to hide. 1,125 hours. Over Magdeburg, the sky is chaos. Fighters tangle in a dozen separate engagements. Contrails spiral and cross. Parachutes blossom. German, American, it's impossible to tell from a distance. The bombers press on, steady, inexorable, their formations tightening as flak bursts pepper the sky ahead. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, flying an FW-190, makes a single pass at a B-17 Straggler. His 20mm cannon tears into the bomber's wing, but it doesn't go down. He pulls off, looks for separation to reset the attack, and sees 3 Mustangs diving on him. He doesn't think. He pushes the stick forward, diving vertical, building speed. The Mustangs follow. At 400 miles per hour, Stigler pulls out low, skimming treetops, heading for a nearby airfield. If he can land, rearm, refuel, he can fight again. It's what they've always done. But the Mustangs stay with him. He sees the airfield ahead. FW-190s taxiing, ground crews running. He drops his gear, bleeds speed, lines up for final approach. The Mustangs strafe the runway. Cannon fire rips across the tarmac. An FW-190 explodes before it even takes off. Ground crew dive into ditches. Stigler pulls gear up, firewalls throttle again, and brakes right, still at 50 feet, fuel gauge dropping into red. He's out of options. 1,150 hours. Leipzig approaches. The bomber stream reaches the target area. Flak rises in black clouds. Airburst shells rocking the formations. Bomb bay doors swing open. Bombardiers crouch over Norden sights, synchronized, tracking the factories below. The lead bombardier releases. Thousands of bombs fall in rippling waves, tumbling toward aircraft plants, rail yards, assembly halls. The explosions march across Leipzig like drumbeats. Messerschmitt factories erupt in flame. Fuel depots detonate. The concussion waves reach up, buffeting the bombers even at altitude. Smoke rises in columns thousands of feet high, staining the winter sky black. But the Germans aren't finished. Luftwaffe fighters, bleeding and desperate, press attacks through the flak. A Bf-110 destroyer, twin-engine and heavily armed, barrels into a bomber formation from head-on, cannon blazing. A B-17 staggers, wing folding, spiraling down. Another takes hits in the cockpit, pilot killed instantly, co-pilot wrestling the controls. P-51s intercept the Bf-110 as it breaks away. The fight is brief. The twin-engine fighter can't maneuver with Mustangs. It breaks apart in midair, both crewmen lost. Around Leipzig, the battle rages for 20 minutes. Bombers drop their loads and turn west. Fighters swarm the Luftwaffe interceptors, protecting the withdrawal. The Germans try to reform, try to mount coordinated attacks, but the American fighters won't let them consolidate. Every attempt to regroup draws Mustangs and Lightnings like sharks to blood. 1,220 hours. Egress route, heading west. The bombers are leaving German airspace, but the killing isn't over. Damaged B-17s lag behind, struggling to keep formation. German fighters, low on fuel and ammunition themselves, make desperate passes at the stragglers. Some succeed. Bombers fall, crews bailing out over occupied Europe. But most attacks are broken up by escorts who've stayed with the formation. Even now, 500 miles inside the mission, the American fighters have fuel to fight. Luftwaffe pilots, by contrast, are flying on fumes. They break off individually, heading for the nearest airfields. Some don't make it. Engines quit mid-flight, fuel exhausted. Pilots bail out or glide dead stick in a crash landings. The survivors who reach their bases find more chaos. Strafing attacks have cratered runways, destroyed parked aircraft, killed ground crew. Some fields are unusable. Others have no fuel to rearm returning fighters. Pilots land, taxi to dispersal areas, and sit in their cockpits, exhausted, knowing they'll fly again tomorrow if they survive that long. The Americans, meanwhile, are already planning the next mission. 1,500 hours. RAF Debden. The 4th Fighter Group's Mustangs return in ragged intervals. Some have battle damage, bullet holes in wings, shattered canopies, hydraulic leaks. One lands gear up, sliding down the runway in a shower of sparks. The pilot climbs out uninjured, grinning. Another doesn't return at all. Last seen chasing a Bf-109 east of Hanover. Missing. Presumed lost. But the group claims 17 kills. Debriefing rooms buzz with adrenaline. Pilots talk over each other, hands tracing dogfight geometries in the air. Gun camera footage will confirm or refute claims later, but the energy is undeniable. They fought deep inside Germany, stayed with the bombers, hunted aggressively, and came home. It worked. Colonel Blakesley listens to the reports, nods, says nothing. He knows this is just day one. Big Week has 5 more days to go, but the precedent is set. The Luftwaffe just lost its safe airspace. February 22nd, 1944. Luftwaffe Operations Command, Berlin. The situation maps tell a story no one wants to read. Red markers, losses, cluster across northern Germany. Entire Staffeln are below operational strength. Fuel depots report critical shortages. Airfields are damaged. Pilot casualties from the last 48 hours exceed 10% of available fighter strength. And the Americans are coming again. General Major Adolf Galland stands before the map, jaw tight. He's argued for concentrated defense, for massing fighters at decisive points rather than dispersing them across hundreds of miles. But Göring's orders remain unchanged. Intercept everything, everywhere, all the time. It's suicide by doctrine. A staff officer reports morning reconnaissance. Over 1,000 American bombers forming up over England. Targets likely Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Augsburg. The same deep penetration missions that cost the Americans so dearly 6 months ago. But 6 months ago, the bombers flew unescorted over Germany. Now, Every bomber has a fighter shadowing it all the way to target. Galland asks the question everyone knows the answer to. How many sorties can we launch? The staff officer hesitates. Perhaps 350 fighters. Maybe 400 if we pull reserves from training units. Against 1,000 bombers and 600 escorts. The math is unsustainable. 0945 hours. 26,000 feet above the Rhine. The bomber stream crosses into Germany. A formation so vast it takes 15 minutes to pass overhead a single point on the ground. Condensation trails fill the sky like spiderwebs. The roar of thousands of engines is audible even over the wind. And wrapped around the bombers, in layers, weaving like wolves, the American fighters. P-51 Mustangs fly top cover at 30,000 feet. P-47 Thunderbolts hold the flanks. P-38 Lightnings range ahead, sweeping airspace. The formation is a moving fortress, layered defense in 3 dimensions, coordinated by radio, flying deeper into the Reich than any force has gone with full protection. Below, Luftwaffe controllers vector fighters toward intercept points. But every attempt to concentrate forces draws immediate American response. Fighter sweeps ahead of the bombers disrupt German assembly areas. Luftwaffe units trying to form up are bounced before they reach combat altitude. Those that do reach the bombers find themselves fighting through screens of escorts, burning fuel, taking losses, unable to press sustained attacks. The tactical situation has inverted completely. 1,035 hours. Near Schweinfurt, Hauptmann Heinrich Oehler leads his Gruppe toward the bomber stream. His pilots are young, too young. Half have fewer than 10 combat missions. They fly decent formation, but when the chaos starts, formation won't save them. He spots the B-17s, tight boxes at 24,000 feet, and calls the attack. They dive, building speed, angling for head-on pass. It's the only tactic that still works. Hit fast, hit hard, break through before the escorts react. But the escorts are already reacting. Mustangs peel off high cover, diving to intercept. Oehler sees them coming. Knows his Gruppe won't have time for a second pass. One run. That's all they get. His wingman opens fire at 800 meters, too far, wasting ammunition. Oehler holds until 400 meters, squeezes the trigger, feels the FW-190 shudder as cannon shells arc toward the lead bomber. Hits sparkle across the B-17's nose. Then he's past, rolling inverted, pulling through, diving away. Behind him, his Gruppe scatters. 2 of his pilots never pull out of the dive. One takes a Mustang's burst through the cockpit, dead before he knows he's hit. Another collides with a B-17's wing, both aircraft disintegrating in a fireball. Oehler levels out at 10,000 feet. Alone, fuel gauge already showing half empty. He checks 6 o'clock. Clear. Checks again. Still clear. For now. He turns east, away from the bombers, away from the Mustangs, and realizes with cold clarity that there's no winning this anymore. There's only surviving until tomorrow and trying again and hoping the fuel lasts long enough to land. 1,115 hours. Regensburg. The bombs fall like rain. Messerschmitt production facilities erupt in overlapping explosions. Assembly buildings collapse. Machine shops burn. Warehouses stacked with aircraft components detonate as fires reach fuel and ammunition stores. The smoke rises thick enough to obscure entire city blocks. On the ground, workers scramble into shelters. The all-clear won't sound for another 20 minutes. Some won't live that long. Delayed fuse bombs are still exploding hours after the raid ends, killing rescue crews and engineers trying to assess damage. Above, the bombers turn for home. The Luftwaffe tries one more massed attack during the egress, throwing everything available at the trailing formations. They claim 6 bombers, but they lose 14 fighters in the attempt, and most surviving German pilots land with empty guns and dry tanks at fields too damaged to efficiently rearm them. The cost-benefit equation is collapsing. February 25, 1944. The final day of Big Week. 6 days of maximum effort have gutted the Luftwaffe. Over 2,600 bomber sorties. Nearly 1,000 fighter escort sorties. Tens of thousands of tons of bombs dropped on aircraft factories, component plants, and assembly facilities across Germany. Losses are heavy. 226 American bombers destroyed, over 2,000 aircrew killed or captured. But the Luftwaffe loses more. German records, pieced together after the war, show catastrophic attrition. Over 355 fighter pilots killed or missing during Big Week. Not just killed, irreplaceable veterans, experienced flight leaders, men who'd survived years of combat. Their loss cascades through the force. Training units are stripped to fill frontline gaps. Replacement pilots arrive with minimal preparation and die within days. Aircraft production is disrupted, but not destroyed. German factories will recover, disperse, adapt. But pilot losses can't be replaced at this rate. The Luftwaffe is bleeding out, and the Americans know it. March 1944. The new reality. By March, the pattern is entrenched. American bombers strike German targets at will. Fighter escorts range across the Reich, hunting Luftwaffe aircraft in the air and on the ground. German pilots who survive combat often die during landing approaches, shot down by Mustangs loitering over their own airfields. The Luftwaffe tries desperate countermeasures. They launch fighters from autobahns to avoid cratered runways. They disperse units to minimize strafing losses. They experiment with heavily armed FW-190s carrying rockets, hoping to stand off beyond escort range and fire into bomber boxes. None of it changes the fundamental equation. The Luftwaffe is outnumbered, outranged, and losing the attrition war. Oberleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, a veteran ace, writes candidly in his logbook, "We can hurt them. We can bring down bombers, kill their pilots. But we cannot stop them. And every day, there are fewer of us and more of them." That imbalance becomes the defining feature of the air war through spring 1944. April 1944. Göring's Reich. Hermann Göring, confronted with undeniable losses, refuses to accept responsibility. He accuses his pilots of cowardice. He claims they exaggerate American fighter performance. He issues orders mandating ramming attacks, pilots deliberately colliding with bombers if ammunition runs out. Some pilots comply, dying in suicidal crashes. Others refuse, risk courts-martial, and keep flying conventional missions. Morale craters. Galland, increasingly sidelined, watches the force disintegrate. He pushes for the Me-262 jet fighter, arguing it's the only platform that can compete with American escorts. But Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber delays deployment. When jets finally reach operational units in mid-1944, there's insufficient fuel to train pilots and too few airframes to matter strategically. The Luftwaffe is trapped in a death spiral. Losses exceed training capacity, which lowers pilot quality, which increases losses, which overwhelms the training pipeline further. There's no way out. May 1944. Airspace surrendered. By late spring, the Luftwaffe effectively concedes daylight air superiority over Germany. Fighter units are pulled back, conserved for critical interceptions only. They no longer contest every raid. They no longer engage American fighters aggressively. They survive, hiding at dispersed fields, flying only when odds favor even momentary success. The Americans own the sky. P-51s roam freely, attacking transportation networks, oil facilities, anything that moves by day. The Reich's logistics collapse under relentless air pressure. Fuel shipments are strafed. Trains are destroyed. Trucks hide under trees, moving only at night. And critically, this air superiority enables the next phase of the war, invasion. D-Day, scheduled for June 6, 1944, depends on Allied control of the skies over the English Channel and Normandy. The Luftwaffe, battered and depleted, will barely contest the landings. On D-Day itself, German fighters manage fewer than 100 sorties against thousands of Allied aircraft. The air war, for all practical purposes, is over. The Luftwaffe still exists on paper. Units, airfields, aircraft in production. But as a fighting force capable of influencing strategic outcomes, it's finished. The collapse of the safe air corridors, the arrival of long-range American escorts, the relentless attrition through Big Week and beyond. These are the moments that broke the Luftwaffe's back. And from here, there's no recovery. June 1944. The smoke of Big Week has settled, but the scars on the Luftwaffe have not. Germany's fighter force, once the pride of the Reich, is now a thin shadow stretched across too many responsibilities and too few resources. On paper, the Luftwaffe still fields hundreds of aircraft. In reality, only a fraction are flyable, and fewer still have pilots capable of flying them effectively. The numbers tell the truth bluntly. Between January and March 1944, the Luftwaffe loses over 33% of its operational fighter pilots. By July, attrition approaches half of the remaining trained airmen. These aren't raw recruits. These are veterans, aces with years of survival instinct burned into muscle memory. Men whose experience stitched together the thin line between Germany's remaining air defense and complete collapse. Their replacements arrive with barely the basics. Most have 70 to 80 total flying hours. Some less. Night fighter trainees are converted to daylight units without proper transition training. Pilots who haven't practiced formation flying are sent into skies filled with Mustangs and Thunderbolts. A few receive only classroom lectures on bomber interception tactics, no live-fire training, no mock dogfights. The results are predictable. Casualty rates spike. Green pilots last 5 sorties on average. Many never fire a shot. Some never even see the Mustang that kills them. Gun camera footage from American fighters shows engagements over in seconds. A burst of .50 caliber, a flash of fire, a falling aircraft. One more name added to a casualty list that grows faster than headquarters can track. The psychological impact is worse. Veteran pilots, those who survive Big Week, carry a look the younger officers whisper about, a dull, fixed stare like a man counting the days until the end. They know what the new recruits don't. Victory is no longer the objective. Survival is, and even that is slipping away. Reports from German field hospitals describe waves of pilots suffering from exhaustion, frostbite, untreated concussions, and chronic oxygen deprivation. Squadron commanders write increasingly desperate memos requesting rest periods, better rations, more support staff. Luftwaffe High Command responds with orders to fly harder. A bitter joke spreads among pilots. The Americans fly to live. We fly to die. It's gallows humor, but it reflects the truth. Airfields across Germany resemble triage stations more than operational bases. Cratered runways sit half-repaired. Dispersal shelters hide aircraft under netting, surrounded by scorched earth where Mustangs recently strafed. Fuel trucks are camouflaged under tree lines. Mechanics work in silence, exhausted, unable to keep up with the pace of losses. And looming over everything is the fuel crisis. Allied bombing of German synthetic oil plants, Luna, Politz, Bolin, begins to choke the Reich supply chain. Aviation fuel production plunges. Fighter units receive so little fuel that pilots are instructed to glide during training flights to conserve reserves. Some bases ground their aircraft entirely on non-combat days. Engines seize from poor lubrication. Tanks run dry mid-sortie. One Luftwaffe maintenance officer writes in a confidential report, "We have aircraft, but no fuel. Pilots, but no hours to train them. Orders, but no way to carry them out." The German High Command refuses to acknowledge the scale of the crisis. Göring blames sabotage. Hitler blames defeatism. Neither addresses the cold arithmetic of air warfare. Pilots cannot fight without fuel and cannot survive without training. The Americans, meanwhile, intensify the pressure. Fighter-bomber groups sweep German airspace daily. Rail junctions, oil trains, and motorized convoys are attacked on sight. P-47s flatten airfields with rockets and bombs. P-51s loiter at high altitude, waiting for anything with propellers to climb into their kill zone. The Luftwaffe's attempts at countermeasures, armored flight lines, rapid dispersal tactics, decoy aircraft, only delay the inevitable. By early summer, German commanders begin to acknowledge privately what they cannot say publicly. The Luftwaffe no longer exists as an effective daylight force. It can still take lives. It can still inflict damage. But it cannot change strategy, cannot protect the Reich, and cannot slow the Allied advance. The collapse of the safe air corridors has become something larger. The collapse of German air power itself. And the consequences will ripple beyond the skies and into the final year of the war. By late summer 1944, the collapse of the Luftwaffe's daylight fighter arm is no longer just a military failure. It reshapes the entire trajectory of the war. The shift begins with doctrine. Before 1944, air power theory across multiple nations still entertained the belief that bombers alone could break a nation's industrial backbone. Escort fighters were considered secondary, supportive tools meant to help bombers reach their targets, not instruments of strategic decision-making. But the P-51 Mustang rewrites that doctrine. The lesson is unmistakable. Air superiority is not an optional condition. It is the foundation of modern warfare. Fighters don't just protect bombers, they enable strategy itself. Without them, bombing campaigns collapse. With them, entire enemy air forces can be dismantled in months. The Luftwaffe's downfall becomes the textbook case. Militaries around the world, British, American, Soviet, and later post-war powers, studied the events of early 1944 with clinical detail. They analyzed Big Week, the escort breakthrough, the systemic destruction of pilot pools, and the psychological collapse that followed. The conclusion is unanimous. A nation that loses control of its airspace loses the war beneath it. Germany experiences this reality with crushing speed. The loss of air superiority opens the door to the systematic destruction of the Reich's infrastructure. Oil plants are the first to fall, then transportation hubs, then rail networks, then hardened industrial facilities that had once seemed safe deep within German territory. American bombers strike around the clock. Fighter bombers hit targets during daylight hours with precision and mobility that German defenses cannot counter. The entire German economy begins to unravel, not because factories can't produce machines, but because they can't move them, fuel them, or protect them. This operational vacuum pushes Germany into technological desperation. The Me-262 jet, the world's first operational jet fighter, becomes the Reich's final hope. Its speed and firepower are extraordinary, but the jet enters the war too late and in too few numbers to offset the air superiority crisis. Pilots lack proper conversion training. Engines flame out after hours of use. Airfields are cratered before jets can take off. Even Hitler's insistence on using the Me-262 as a bomber reflects the dysfunction that ruined Germany's strategic adaptability. Every attempt to reverse the tide is reactive, improvised, or sabotaged by leadership interference. Meanwhile, the Allies ride the momentum. With the Luftwaffe unable to contest the skies, the strategic initiative belongs entirely to the United States and Britain. The Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, succeed not because the beaches are lightly defended, but because the skies above them are empty of German fighters. Allied ships unload uninterrupted. Airborne divisions drop with minimal opposition. Panzer divisions, which could have exacted horrific casualties, are paralyzed, unable to move by day or mass without attracting swarms of Mustangs and Thunderbolts. The collapse of German air defense doesn't just weaken the Wehrmacht. It isolates it. Divisions on the Eastern Front receive less fuel. Supply chains in Italy and the Balkans fracture. Reinforcements from Germany arrive poorly supplied and easily targeted. Every part of the Reich's war machine begins to starve. And across the country, German civilians experience a new reality. Air raid sirens no longer signal the start of isolated raids. They signal the collapse of an entire world. Cities burn for days. Refugees fill rail stations, only to be caught in strafing runs by Allied fighters. Factories operate at night because daylight invites destruction. Everyday life becomes a calculation of survival. The Luftwaffe can do little more than watch. Veteran officers write bleak assessments. We no longer defend the Reich. We merely record its disintegration. By autumn, even the most loyal Nazi commanders recognize the truth. Germany's defeat is no longer a question of if, but when. And the final phase of the war, its brutal, unrelenting closing chapter, will unfold under skies the Luftwaffe no longer controls. The consequences of losing those last safe air corridors echo far beyond 1944. They signal not just a military defeat, but the end of an era in which Germany held any power in the air. And they lead into a deeper question, one that history rarely allows pilots, generals, or nations to escape. A question that sits at the heart of every war fought in the skies. War in the air has always carried a particular kind of paradox. From the ground, battles seem distant, abstract, removed from the mud and blood where most soldiers fight and die. But the pilots who flew above Europe in 1944 knew the truth. Altitude doesn't soften war. It sharpens it. At 25,000 feet, survival is measured in seconds, and decisions shape not just missions but the destinies of nations. The collapse of Germany's last safe air corridors was more than a tactical shift. It marked the moment air warfare fully entered its modern age, an age defined not by courage alone, but by range, industry, fuel, and the relentless mathematics of attrition. The Luftwaffe had courage in abundance, skill honed over years, and some of the finest pilots the world had ever seen. But courage without fuel is helpless. Skill without replacements is temporary. And experience, no matter how deep, can't outfly a system built to overwhelm it. As American long-range fighters crossed deeper into the Reich, the air war revealed a truth as old as conflict itself. The side that controls the sky controls the rhythm of the war beneath it. Villages, cities, rail yards, convoys, all became visible, vulnerable, exposed. And in that exposure, the strategic fate of Germany was sealed. The Luftwaffe did not lose because its pilots lacked bravery. It lost because it could no longer choose the terms of the fight. And when a force can't choose its battles, it simply endures them. For the men who flew in those months, German and American, the war was not an exercise in ideology. It was a test of endurance, limits, and luck. Many never returned. Others carried the weight of those skies for the rest of their lives. Their stories remind us that technological advantage is never bloodless, and strategic victory is never without human cost. In the end, the fall of those last safe air corridors was more than a turning point in the European theater. It was the moment air power proved its decisive role in shaping the modern world. A world where the outcome of wars is determined not just by armies on the ground, but by the unseen battles fought thousands of feet above them.